the world did not expect it. In fact, no one believed Burkina Faso had the capability, the resources, or even the geopolitical courage to cross this line. But in early 2025, when news broke that Captain Ibrahim Traoré had authorized the deployment of Burkinabe troops, armored vehicles, long-range tactical drones, and battlefield surveillance equipment into Sudan to support the Sudanese army, a shockwave rippled across the international stage. Analysts dismissed it as rumor. Western policymakers labeled it impossible. Neighboring governments whispered that it was reckless. But soon, satellite images, leaked military convoy videos, and official statements from Ouagadougou confirmed what was once unthinkable. Burkina Faso was now exporting military power. The world was forced to ask a question it never anticipated. How did a landlocked nation fighting its own internal battles transform into a rising military force capable of supplying another country at war? And more specifically, how did Ibrahim Traoré pull this off? In the beginning, most thought it was symbolic support, a diplomatic gesture. Perhaps a few advisors, maybe humanitarian aid dressed as military cooperation. But the footage told a different story. Cargo planes carrying Burkinabe-made drones touched down on Sudanese airstrips. Armored personnel carriers, freshly painted in desert camouflage, bearing the insignia of Burkina Faso's new defense industries, rolled through the dust. Military engineers set up mobile command units, equipped with locally developed satellite-linked reconnaissance systems. Burkinabe special forces were seen strategizing alongside Sudanese commanders, breaking down battlefield maps and assessing rebel supply routes. Sudan had been struggling to contain multiple rebel factions, and the conflict was tearing through its infrastructure and economy. The Sudanese army needed equipment, manpower, and technological eyes in the sky. But Western aid came with conditions. Gulf support was inconsistent, and regional alliances were already stretched thin. When Traoré stepped forward and openly declared that Burkina Faso would not watch another African nation collapse under the weight of rebellion and foreign manipulation, the world stayed silent not because it disagreed, but because it couldn't make sense of the strategic capability behind the promise. How could a country that was once economically strained, politically fragile, and militarily under-equipped suddenly be delivering weapons-grade drones, armored vehicles, tactical missiles, and real-time satellite surveillance to another sovereign nation? This was the mystery, and this documentary is the unraveling of that mystery. The truth did not emerge immediately. It took weeks of leaked documents, months of investigative reports, and an entire geopolitical shift to understand the scale of what Traoré had been quietly building. Long before the deployment into Sudan, Burkina Faso had already begun constructing a military-industrial ecosystem unlike anything the region had ever seen. Factories expanded in secrecy. Engineers trained abroad returned home with new blueprints. Economic reforms redirected funds from foreign loans to domestic innovation. Local investors, for the first time in decades, poured money into national projects instead of foreign ventures. And the people, yes, the ordinary citizens were brought into the strategy, becoming stakeholders in their own country's rise. Burkina Faso wasn't copying the Western defense model. It was reinventing it from the inside out. The story begins much earlier than the 2025 announcement, but the world only paid attention once Sudanese convoys were seen escorted by Burkinabe drone formations to site that, just months prior, would have been dismissed as science fiction. Sudan needed a partner who understood asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics, and the harsh realities of fighting enemies who blend into landscapes. Burkina Faso had spent years confronting insurgencies across its territory, learning the patterns of irregular warfare, studying rebel mobility, and perfecting drone-aided reconnaissance. What they lacked in heavy traditional hardware, they compensated for with innovation, adaptability, and an unusually strong societal unity that emerged after years of shared struggle. When Traoré offered Sudan the support it desperately needed, it was not charity, it was strategy. For decades, African conflicts have been shaped, influenced, or outright controlled by external forces. Weapon imports dictated alliances. Aid packages determined political direction. Satellite intelligence came with strings attached. But for the first time, one African nation was providing another with weapons, intelligence, logistics, and tactical military infrastructure without Western approval, without international oversight, and without dependence on foreign funds. This move was more than an act of solidarity. It was a rebellion against the geopolitical hierarchy. Burkina Faso had just announced itself as a rising power in African security affairs, not with speeches or promises, but with military capability. And while the world debated, doubted, or dismissed the announcement, Traoré pushed forward with a plan years in the making. The factories kept humming. Convoys kept moving. Satellite feeds kept streaming into Sudanese command centers. What unfolded next was not merely military support, it was a demonstration of a nation reinventing itself. By the time global intelligence agencies confirmed the full truth, it was already too late. Burkina Faso had changed the geopolitical balance, and no one saw it coming. The story of how this transformation happened is a story of economic reinvention, strategic autonomy, local empowerment, and a leader who believed that Africa could solve Africa's problems if given the space to build, innovate, and defend itself. This is a story of how a country the world underestimated became strong enough to influence the outcome of a foreign war. It is a story that begins with a simple idea. No African nation should stand alone. And in the next chapter of this unfolding saga, we explore exactly how that idea evolved into drones, missiles, armored vehicles, and boots on the ground sent across borders to alter the future of an entire region. The truth behind Burkina Faso's sudden rise in military capability did not emerge publicly. It was never announced in conferences, never broadcast on television, never written into glossy government reports. It unfolded quietly, behind factory doors, in repurposed warehouses, inside underground research facilities, and within the minds of young engineers who were finally given both the funding and freedom to imagine a different future for their country. What the world did not see were the years leading up to 2025, where Burkina Faso began dismantling the notion that military power must be purchased from abroad. Instead of relying on traditional models of foreign-funded security assistance, Traoré's administration turned inward. They began by identifying the greatest vulnerabilities in the country: insurgency, porous borders, outdated equipment, and a lack of intelligence capability. Instead of importing a ready-made solution, they built the foundation of a domestic defense ecosystem. The first step was economic stabilization. Traoré understood that a nation cannot build military strength on a weak financial backbone. That is why the earlier economic reforms, which many analysts dismiss as overly idealistic, became the cornerstone of everything that followed. Local investors, long discouraged by corruption, inefficiency, and foreign control, were invited to participate directly in the construction of national industries. Ownership was shared, accountability was forced, and corruption was aggressively purged. Factories that once produced agricultural tools quietly expanded their capabilities. Workshops that specialized in mechanical repair were upgraded to produce armor plates, chassis components, and vehicle shells. University labs became hubs for drone prototyping. Instead of importing foreign specialists at exorbitant costs, the government sponsored young engineers to train abroad, but with one condition: they must return and build a home. They returned with knowledge from Turkey, Iran, Brazil, China, Russia, South Africa, countries that had themselves once stood where Burkina Faso stood, learning how to build military capability with limited resources. These engineers brought back more than designs. They brought back philosophies: build small, build smart, build cost-effective, build resilient. By 2023, while the world focused on large-scale geopolitical shifts, Burkina Faso was already manufacturing its first operational drones. They weren't designed to compete with the billion-dollar UAV programs of superpowers. They were built for asymmetric conflict, for tracking insurgent movements in forests and deserts, for identifying routes used by armed groups, for providing reconnaissance to ground troops with real-time imagery. They were cheap, rugged, modular, and efficient. The success of the drone initiative sparked a wave of momentum. Private investors who had never imagined themselves part of the defense industry suddenly saw opportunity. Farmers invested, teachers invested, business owners invested. For the first time in modern history, Burkina Faso's military capability was becoming a project of its own people. The true turning point came when economic policies shifted from dependence on foreign aid to internal capital generation. Instead of sending millions of dollars abroad to pay for outdated weapons, Burkina Faso poured that money into domestic production. And the results were startling. In less than 2 years, They could produce armored vehicles suited for desert and jungle terrains. They developed lightweight missile systems that could be mounted on pickups or drones. They built communications infrastructure that allowed units in remote regions to access encrypted satellite feeds. What outsiders failed to grasp was that Burkina Faso wasn't trying to match Western or Russian power. They were building a new model of warfare adapted to realities of African conflict. Unpredictable terrain, guerrilla fighters, shifting alliances, and low-cost mobility. The entire system was built around speed, adaptability, and intelligence. Western militaries operate on massive budgets, complex logistics, and reliance on air superiority. Burkina Faso built a system that could be deployed quickly, repaired locally, sustained cheaply, and operated by soldiers who understood the terrain better than any foreign advisor. And while internal developments accelerated, something else was happening almost unnoticed. Burkina Faso began receiving quiet requests from neighboring countries, assistance in drone surveillance, joint border operations, training exchanges, maintenance support. The region had never seen Burkina Faso as a security provider, but now, for the first time, they had capabilities that even some larger economies lacked. Traoré understood the significance of this shift. It meant influence. It meant autonomy. It meant that Burkina Faso was no longer simply reacting to regional conflicts, it could shape them. But helping Sudan was not born out of political ambition alone. It came from a deeper fear shared across the continent. The collapse of a major African state does not stay contained within its borders. The ripple effects refugees, insurgents, weapons smuggling, economic destabilization would reach every nation in the Sahel. To Traoré, Sudan's struggle was not a distant civil war. It was a threat waiting to cross borders. Yet offering help was one thing. Delivering military aid on a scale large enough to shift the balance in Sudan was another. And this is where the world's confusion began. How could Burkina Faso afford it? The answer, once again, lay in the shift from dependency to self-reliance. Every drone shipped to Sudan was made in Burkina Faso. Every armored vehicle delivered had been assembled in a facility built by local investors. Every missile system used Burkina Faso's own components. Even the satellite-linked surveillance tools came from partnerships with nations that did not impose political leverage in exchange for technological cooperation. This wasn't a superpower giving aid. This was a nation that had reinvented itself using the resources, creativity, and determination of its own people. And yet, even as all of this unfolded, the world continued to underestimate the strategic depth behind Traoré's decisions. The truth is that the support for Sudan was not only military, it was symbolic. It signaled the arrival of a new African doctrine, nations solving their own military and political problems without external permission. Sudan's requests for support had been ignored or dismissed by many of the usual international actors. But Burkina Faso responded within days, not because of alliances or treaties, but because the calculus was simple. Instability in Sudan would eventually destabilize the region. And if no one else would act, Burkina Faso would. Cargo planes lifted off from Ouagadougou under the cover of darkness, not because the mission was secret, but because the world was not yet ready to accept that Burkina Faso had become capable of such operations. Drone crates were marked with serial numbers from newly built assembly lines. Armored vehicles moved across the tarmac on reinforced ramps. Operators briefed Sudanese officers on targeting protocols, reconnaissance strategies, and counterinsurgency patterns that Burkina Faso had mastered long before. For the Sudanese General Staff, it was a lifeline. For the region, it was a political earthquake. For the world, it was a complete recalibration of who held power in Africa. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could help Sudan. The question was how far this new capability could reach, and what it would mean for the future of a continent long shaped by foreign interests. And as the first Burkinabe drones took off from Sudanese soil, lighting up the night sky with their quiet engines and steady navigation lights, the world realized that the rise of Burkina Faso was not an anomaly. It was a new beginning. The uneasy silence that followed in international circles wasn't just the absence of condemnation. It was the sound of geopolitical calculations spinning behind closed doors. Because everyone from Washington to Paris, from Ankara to Abu Dhabi was trying to understand the same thing. How did Burkina Faso pull this off? And more importantly, what was coming next? while analysts scrambled to update outdated intelligence briefs. The situation on the ground was shifting faster than any spreadsheet could keep up with. Rebels were losing footholds they had held for years, and the Sudanese army was adapting with a speed that startled even its own officers. The rhythm of war had changed. It no longer followed the slow, grinding tempo of attrition. It moved with the precision of coordinated surveillance, real-time data, and the kind of discipline that only comes when soldiers feel they finally have a chance. Inside Sudan's Joint Operations Room, the air buzzed with urgency. Officers leaned over digital screens that displayed troop movements in glowing arcs of yellow and red. The drone feed streamed in with clarity no one had seen before, tagging potential ambush points, heat signatures, even the direction of fleeing rebel convoys. And each time the system pinged, the room erupted in a flurry of commands, orders snapped, coordinates relayed, units deployed. But beneath all the excitement, there was something deeper. For many officers, this wasn't just military coordination, it was redemption. Sudan's army had been ridiculed for years, divided, disorganized, undermined by corruption, abandoned by supposed allies. Now, for the first time in a long time, they were fighting like a real force, the kind of force a nation could depend on. Across the battle lines, rebel groups felt the shift in momentum like a tightening rope around their operations. Their fighters grumbled that the skies belonged to someone else now. Their commanders complained that no matter how they moved, someone was watching. Camps were abandoned overnight, weapons caches relocated hastily, and supply routes scattered like broken glass. But even as they scrambled, they whispered a new fear. This isn't just Sudan's army anymore. Someone is helping them. Someone smart. Not all of them knew the name, but everyone could feel the presence. Burkina Faso. It wasn't supposed to be possible. A landlocked West African nation, turning the tides of a conflict almost 3,000 kilometers away. A country dismissed as fragile now influencing the trajectory of an entire region's stability. Some rebels mocked it at first, calling it illusion, propaganda, psychological warfare, until they saw the impact up close. A column of rebel technicals attempted to flank a Sudanese unit through a dried riverbed on the outskirts of Kasti. It was a maneuver they had used countless times, confident the terrain provided cover. But minutes after the convoy entered the ravine, a drone silently appeared overhead, small, dark, and almost invisible against the dusk sky. Before the rebels had time to react, artillery coordinates were fed to nearby Sudanese batteries. The first shell struck the lead vehicle. The second hit the rear. Within seconds, the entire column was immobilized, engines burning, fighters scattering in panic. What should have been an ambush turned into a rout. Later, survivors spoke with disbelief. The Sudanese shouldn't have known we were there. They've never had this capability. They were right. Until now, back in Ouagadougou, inside government think tanks and military planning rooms, a different conversation was unfolding. Strategists were analyzing data from Sudan, not just battlefield statistics, but the broader implications. Each successful operation, they validated the technological roadmap Burkina Faso had invested in. Each victory was proof that an African-designed system could outperform expectations. It wasn't merely about winning a foreign conflict. It was about proving a model, African-made, African-funded, African-executed, a model that challenged everything the international system had assumed about African nations, that they could not innovate militarily, that they could not sustain industrial growth, that they could not rise without external oversight. Burkina Faso was breaking that narrative piece by piece, and the world felt it. In foreign embassies across Africa, tension spiked. Reports were compiled, cables drafted, emergency meetings held. Some described Burkina Faso's rise as destabilizing. Others warned that this was the emergence of a new military bloc. One intelligence report, leaked months later, issued a chilling prediction. If Burkina Faso can deploy support across continents, it can reshape alliances beyond our ability to predict. But on the streets of Sudan, the reaction was very different. Civilians emerging from months-long conflict zones looked up with cautious hope. Families displaced by fighting whispered that maybe, just maybe, the tide had finally turned. Small shops reopened in areas recently reclaimed by the army. Medical convoys moved more freely. People were cautious. War teaches caution, but there was something softer in their voices. A spark, a possibility, a fragile kind of confidence. In Khartoum, a young man painted a mural of a Burkinabe drone atop the Sudanese and Burkinabe flags, with the words layered beneath in Arabic, "Brothers in resistance, brothers in future." The mural went viral within hours. Elsewhere, soldiers posted videos of themselves testing new equipment, amazed at the technology. In one clip, a Sudanese drone operator lifts a controller with awe and says, "Made in Africa." Who would have believed it? But amidst the excitement, new dangers emerged. Foreign actors watching from the sidelines began probing Sudan's digital systems. Cyber attacks surged. Disinformation campaigns spread online accusing Burkina Faso of imperial ambitions, questioning the legitimacy of the drones, fabricating stories of civilian targeting to create backlash. It wasn't just a military struggle anymore. It was an information war. Sudan's army, caught between the front lines and the digital battlefield, relied even more heavily on Burkina Faso's expertise. Engineers in Ouagadougou worked tirelessly to patch vulnerabilities. Cyber units traced attacks back to servers in multiple countries. A quiet, invisible war unfolded behind the screens, one almost as important as the war on the ground. Meanwhile, rebel groups didn't sit idle. They began approaching foreign arms dealers desperate for systems that could counter the new threat: portable anti-drone weapons, jammers, missiles. But most suppliers hesitated. The conflict was messy, the political risks too high, the outcomes uncertain. This only deepened rebel paranoia, because nothing destabilizes a movement faster than fear. Fear that you are losing control. Fear that your old strategies no longer work. Fear that your enemy is evolving faster than you can adapt. And Sudan's enemies felt that fear acutely now. Across the front lines, there were rebel commanders who once held entire districts in submission. Now they huddled around radios, whispering in frustration as their scouts reported drones circling overhead. Some tried firing blindly into the sky. Others wasted ammunition on shadows. But the sky did not blink, and the drones did not hide. This was the new battlefield, a battlefield they were not prepared for. And while Sudan advanced, the real shockwaves were happening far beyond the desert, in boardrooms and intelligence hubs thousands of miles away. Because if Burkina Faso's model succeeded African-funded military manufacturing, domestic industrialization, and cross-border African alliances, then the old system of dependency would crack. It would mean a continent long shaped by external powers could finally shape itself. That possibility unsettled many. That possibility inspired many more. And so, as the conflict intensified and Sudan found its footing again, one truth became impossible to ignore. Burkina Faso had changed the rules. Quietly, boldly, irreversibly, and the world was only beginning to understand what that meant. The planes touched down in Khartoum under thick desert haze, and for a brief moment, the city held its breath. The arrival of Burkinabe military specialists, engineers, drone operators, tactical advisors did not feel like a foreign intervention. It felt like a lifeline thrown across a continent where nations often watch each other struggle from a distance, held apart by external pressures, borders drawn by colonial pens, and decades of artificially maintained divisions. Sudanese commanders welcomed them not with grand ceremonies, but with the tight, tired embraces of men who had spent years fighting with too little support and too few resources. For them, Burkina Faso's arrival was not symbolic. It was survival taking physical form. And on the ground, the Sudanese soldiers quickly realized that something had shifted. They were no longer operating blind. For the first time in years, they had access to real-time surveillance from satellites that Burkina Faso had recently invested in through regional partnerships. They had drone squadrons capable of mapping rebel movements with precision, tracking supply routes, and marking hostile positions before a single shot was fired. They had armored vehicles that could withstand the brutal terrain and ambush-style warfare that had crippled their units for so long. And most importantly, they had soldiers from a fellow African nation standing shoulder to shoulder with them, not to take control, not to dictate orders, but to reinforce their capacity to defend their homeland. Within weeks, the tide began to turn. Sudanese and Burkinabe strategists built joint operation centers, combining their knowledge of local terrain with the advanced tactical frameworks that Burkina Faso had refined through its own battles against insurgency. The rebels who once moved confidently through unmonitored valleys and border corridors now found themselves exposed under the cold, unblinking eyes of drone reconnaissance. Supply chains that had gone undisturbed for years were intercepted, dismantled, or rerouted into traps. The silence that usually preceded attacks was broken by the hum of surveillance aircraft scanning from above, shifting in coordinated patterns that left no hiding place untouched. What shocked the world was not just the sudden efficiency of Sudan's military operations, but the sophistication of the equipment being used. Many nations, particularly those accustomed to viewing Africa as a passive recipient of military aid rather than producer of it, were forced to reevaluate their assumptions. How had Burkina Faso developed drones that could stay airborne for long durations in extreme heat? How had a nation with a modest industrial base engineered armored vehicles capable of withstanding high-caliber weapons? And most unsettling for some foreign observers, how had this all been achieved without the assistance of major Western defense contractors? The answers emerged gradually through independent reports. Burkina Faso had spent the last 3 years quietly building a domestic military manufacturing ecosystem using local engineers, returning expatriate scientists, and partnerships with non-Western nations. They invested not only in factories but in technical universities. They funded research labs. They offered scholarships to young Burkinabe who wanted to study robotics, aeronautics, metallurgy, or ballistics. And when these students returned, they entered an industry that had been deliberately structured to rely on local knowledge rather than foreign blueprints. By 2025, Burkina Faso was not merely a buyer of military technology, it was a creator. And exporting equipment to Sudan was a moment when the world finally saw what had been brewing behind the scenes. International analysts who once dismissed Traoré as a temporary military leader suddenly realized they were witnessing the birth of something much larger. The emergence of an African defense industry rising independently from Western oversight. But beneath all the strategy, beyond the geopolitics and the shockwaves rippling through global media, the driving force remained surprisingly human. Traoré believed that African nations had a responsibility to each other, a responsibility long forgotten, buried under decades of isolation and hesitation. When he said, "Our brothers bleed, and we cannot pretend not to hear," it was not political theater. He meant it, and for many Africans watching from home, that sincerity was more powerful than any drone or missile. In Sudan, soldiers began wearing patches with both nations' flags stitched together. It was a quiet expression of unity, a reminder that in a world where alliances often shift with the wind, this partnership was built not on treaties or conditions, but on respect. Sudanese civilians, once accustomed to seeing foreign troops only during humanitarian crises or peacekeeping missions, were now witnessing the presence of African forces sent purely to strengthen their own army's hand. And as victories accumulated, as liberated towns raised their flags again, the narrative began to change. Commentators who once described Burkina Faso as a struggling landlocked state now spoke of it as a regional force with the power to alter the trajectory of conflicts beyond its borders. Critics who doubted its ability to sustain such operations conceded reluctantly that the results were undeniable, and ordinary Africans watching from Mali, Niger, Chad, Ethiopia, and beyond began to ask a simple question: if Burkina Faso can do this, why not us? This shift in perception may have been the most profound outcome of all. It signaled a psychological break from dependency, a new understanding of what African nations could achieve when they trusted in their people, invested in their industries, and supported each other rather than waiting for permission or assistance from distant capitals. When the final phase of the joint operation concluded and Sudanese villages once plagued by fighting began to rebuild, the departing Burkinabe units left behind more than equipment. They left behind training programs, intelligence networks, engineering expertise, and a renewed confidence within Sudan's military ranks. They did not take credit for victories. They emphasized Sudan's leadership at every opportunity. And when Sudanese generals held their press briefings, they described their visitors not as external forces, but as brothers in arms. As the last plane lifted off from Khartoum International Airport, Traoré addressed his nation. He spoke not of power, not of pride, but of responsibility. He reminded them that their strength meant nothing if it did not serve a greater purpose. He insisted that the true measure of progress was not in the weapons they built, but in the stability they could help create across the continent. And the world, watching from afar with mixed emotions, finally understood the message he had been delivering all along. Burkina Faso was not trying to dominate. It was trying to demonstrate that African nations could rise without external approval, demonstrate that unity could replace dependency, demonstrate that sovereignty meant more than borders, it meant self-belief. In the months that followed, international analysts scrambled to revise their predictions. Diplomats sought new alliances. Western powers issued carefully worded statements expressing concern and interest. But by then, the shift had already begun. African nations held private conferences to discuss regional manufacturing partnerships. Investors from across the continent explored the possibility of replicating Burkina Faso's economic model. And young Africans, engineers, technicians, soldiers, entrepreneurs looked at their hands and saw potential where they had once seen limits. In the end, Traoré's most significant achievement was not the equipment he sent or the victories Sudan won. It was the idea he ignited, that Africa's rise would not come through charity or intervention, but through cooperation and self-determination. As this story closes, the image that remains is not one of war, but the possibility of a continent rewriting its destiny with its own pen, guided by leaders who believe in their people and nations that believe in each other. And whether the world is ready or not, that possibility is already taking shape.